Hi, I'm Bob Garlick, your host. Welcome to Season 3 of the Business Book Talk podcast. On each show, we will discover another great book that can help you improve yourself and your business. So, I invite you to sit back and enjoy this week's author and find out what makes this book a great read. Hi everybody, it's Bob. We're back again with another great book, Choosing Leaders and Choosing to Lead, Science, Politics, and the Intuition in Executive Selection. This is by Douglas Board. I have him on the line here, all the way over in England. Douglas, what have you been doing lately?
I've had a really fun, special thing to do. Last week, I know an editor at the Financial Times, and he used a 25-year sabbatical that they get given at the Financial Times to record an album in which he didn't write the songs, but he played guitar, he sang, he put a band together, and he actually got to perform the album in the Financial Times building. And I was one of the people there. It was great, and I made a special effort to go because what I do in my main day job is now work with people on career change and those moments later in life, usually, when they start to think back and say, what am I really doing spending my time, doing this? Is this what I really want to spend my time?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think we all go through it. It's like, wow, I've been doing this for 15 years or 20 years or 30 years. What's the point? Because you've kind of, 10 years ago is when I peaked, and that's when I was doing amazing things or perceived I was doing amazing things. How can I change it up? How can I challenge myself again? Let's talk a little bit about the book. Why choosing leaders and choosing to lead? Is that a big decision for somebody? Is that what you should look for in a leader, or is that what a leader should look for in himself? Do I really want to lead, or do I want somebody to lead me?
Now, here's a strange thing, or at least I find it strange. The book's based on two main elements. One is I spent 18 years of my working life as a headhunter, working on mainly board-level appointments in this country, the UK, sometimes international organizations, obviously, private sector, public sector, the whole range. And here's what I think is the interesting thing. On the one hand, when I think back to when I made the career change to go from being a financy kind of person to being a headhunter, a senior industrialist, senior businessman, who I went to for advice on it, told me something that ought to have been true, but was profoundly wrong. He said to me, yeah, young man, this is a great, going into headhunting, great thing for you to do with your career, because people are the key to business. And you go be a headhunter, you're really, really going to learn about people, and that's really going to help you get to, wherever you want your career to take you. And I was, 29 years old then. And I thought, yeah, that makes sense to me. People are pretty important business. I'm interested in people. So I took that advice. I don't regret the advice. It's been absolutely fantastic being a headhunter, but it was completely wrong advice. One of the things that I find the strange thing I want to point to is, how is it that when people are such an important part of business success, be it in a small business, medium or large business, or a public corporation, or whatever, how is it that people's skills are so underrated? How is it that in those organizations that are big enough to have HR departments are weak? Why is it that, as a headhunter, I got to do lots of interesting things in terms of senior appointments, but no way was it the route to the top that this man was saying? And then turn around and look at the other way. Look at what you're doing, what you've done with your career, Bob. Look at any career. I think that actually, if you stop and think about it, how well you pick people to go on teams, to go into your organization, take on other roles, is actually one of the things that you would do lots of times through your career. And if you start getting senior, you'll start to do a lot more of, and those choices will get a lot harder and more difficult. So actually, picking people, and for senior roles, that's why I'm calling choosing leaders, is arguably one of the most fundamental business skills, but underrated. We put all those people's skills into a place and we call them soft, and we think they're not very important.
That's it begs the question that should HR be involved in senior management decision making at all, as far as of staff, and then have the people that have the networks, have the relationships with people, and say, look at, we know you're the CEO, we know you're at the board, we need this new member, you guys figure it out, and do all the interviews, and we won't be involved. We will just do medium level to lower level people because it's not as critical. Or is it as critical having an organization understand that you have to fit the right people in at every level?
Boy, do you need the right people at every level, especially at the top. One leg that underlies this book was my 18 years of practical hands-on recruiting, and it got as down and dirty as it can get. The other leg is that I went off, stopped being a headhunter 5 years ago, and did a doctorate. And my research was in really, well, what the hell was I doing for those 18 years, and how could I have done it better? And the book's the product of trying to bring those two things together. And it was very striking to me that I would say that if you think of any organization, small, medium, or large, that's a quality organization, and you think how the junior and middle positions are filled now compared with how they were filled 40 years ago, the chances you'll see a lot of differences. You'll see not just interviews, you'll see possibly psychometrics, possibly job simulation exercise, a whole range of things you might see. But if we go into those organizations and we head for the boardroom, and we say, the people sitting around the boardroom table or around the executive committee, what process did they go through to occupy those seats? Generally, we find very little change from 40 years ago. And again, part of what drove my research and the book was kind of, well, surely this is a bad thing for society. And how does this come to be? Why does HR add so little value when you're making top appointments? Is it because they're not allowed to add much value? Or is it because they haven't got much value to add? It's one of the things I wanted to explore.
So what did you find out?
I think that they haven't got as much value to add as they should have, but hopefully the book could encourage them to break out of a few mindsets that they've got trapped in, and really take the place that I want to see HR take, which is really at the top table as one of the most powerful, significant roles in business, because business is about people.
And it's about the people that they know as well. I think you hire a person not just for their specific skills, but you hire them for their network capabilities because they can bring the right people in. If you come in as a new CEO, usually they shake things up, or if you're coming in as a new manager, you're trying to put your signature on that department so you can claim, hey, look, I made all these changes, so that's why I want to go up on the ladder. And if you bring in a person that's incapable of bringing that, here's my idea, here's our direction, but I don't have any people that I can fill into this new direction for the company, then that will ultimately fail. So does HR even consider somebody's network?
Generally, no. I mean, the reason HR has got good stuff to offer but is stuck, it's kind of hit its own glass ceiling, is that all the good stuff it has had to offer has been fundamentally science-based. And the three words that are in the subtitle of the book are, if you like, the three cores, the wires in the cable that running together make up, what drives business in my view. And they're science, politics, and intuition. So we just stick with science for a second. Science explains both HR's success to date and the fact that it's now for some time been hitting its head against a brick wall when it comes to senior appointments. In other words, all the stuff about how to select well, how to select objectively, how to write a person specification, how to do an interview, all of those kinds of things, they're great and they're science-based. And in order to get that good, high-quality scientific base, they had to be based on junior and middle-level positions because they had to be based on studies in which there were, hundreds of people, get good scientific results from having decent numbers. Now, the thing you just said there about networks, that's generally not captured at all in the most common framework that HR teaches us to use for this, a competency-based framework. Competencies is a long word, We might as well just say skills or something like that. So you might get into a competency framework, the skill that someone should have, the ability to build networks. But that isn't capturing what you're talking about at all. You're talking about that someone might go into a tough spot. It might be a sales role. It might be a turnaround role. It might be a range of things. And actually, not their ability to build networks, but the networks they've actually got and the reputation they've got with those networks. That's an example of something that's not considered at all. Or if we think just back a few weeks, when Citigroup very publicly lost their CEO, that was an individual who, the same day he went, his COO went, and they were a duo that had been together in different companies, I think going back from my memory about 15 plus years. Well, there's a phenomenon that practical business people realize, which is actually when you get a duo, and that's hopefully not just complementary skills, but it's something that's grown over a period of time, two people who really, really trust each other. And trust and loyalty is something that also doesn't fit into the scientific HR framework. So as we get to senior positions, we start hitting more and more things that the science-based frameworks that HR is bringing to the table don't really seem to help very much with.
Now, before we jump into the other two sections, I've just noticed, in the structure of the book, one of my favorite 3 lines here for the chapter 1, 2, and 3, the bad, the good, and was it from bad to good to stuck?
Yeah.
Is that kind of what you're getting at, where because the inadequacies of HR to really grasp what their what the core competencies, they can figure that out, but what are the hidden competencies and the hidden assets of certain organizations, and not grasping that they're stuck, or is it something totally different?
No, that's definitely part of it, but also the fact that part of what's hidden, as we go higher up the organization to kind of higher altitudes, as I call it there, increasingly important bits of stuff are hidden. For example, the politics. So we're talking about the tacit knowledge, the networks, the intangible asset values, and so on, all of those things. Yes, we're talking about the cultures of organizations, absolutely. And we're just saying that these things get more and more intensified so that at senior levels, and by senior levels, I just literally mean the people who sit round the table, and it might be a kitchen table in a small business, but the real decision makers who face the big uncertainties in the business, politics gets to be important. So what those titles, I kind of start with, from bad, if you and I were just let loose to interview people with no training at all, as still happens in some places, we do it really badly. And if anyone's any doubt about that, I kind of in the first chapter just kind of remind us all how badly we do interviewing if we have no training and we just rely on our intuition. So in chapter 2, we roll the story forward and we say, good news, science, HR came along, found a whole bunch of better ways to do these things. Let's just remind ourselves what those things are. I'll try telling this story, and if it goes on too long, Bobby, just stop me.
Okay.
In chapter 2, I recount a lovely study, which comes from a Fortune 50 company that had to pick the people for its very, very top management level. And if you've got the book there, it's on pages 21 and 22. Mm-hmm. And they go through a process where, first of all, they define the competencies. They're going to specify the kind of leadership that they think that company needs to go into the future. And then here's what they do. They take the candidates, who are all internal, and they interview them. I'm just going to read. The candidates underwent tape-recorded interviews, which lasted between 4 and 8.5 hours.
Oh.
Average 4.5. The interviews concentrated on the main challenges, achievements, and learning of the candidates in their current role and earlier in their career. Transcripts of each interview were prepared, typed out, and assessed independently in a blind assessment by 5 expert raters. Again, can you just imagine that process? That is an incredible process that I'd call a cathedral. It's like building a giant building. I'd call it a cathedral of selection. And the God to which that cathedral has been built is science. So that's when you go to the extreme and you say, right, science is the way forward. Let's just be super objective about everything. And what goes out of the window when you try to be super objective is the intuition and the politics. So chapter 2 is good. We got better. We learned that we could do things better than just when we weren't trained. But then we've been stuck. The way we've been choosing people for our most senior leadership roles in business, in government, in all walks of life, has not been getting better for the last 40 years. And unless we think differently, it's not going to get any better.
That begs the question, why is it not getting better? Is it because we're weeding out, because we don't have enough time, or we have an assumption we don't have enough time, that we're through science and through this process of like, oh, come on in, and okay, great, thank you very much, we got another person. You're inundated with too many choices, too many decisions, and you never really get a chance to sit down and have a beer with the person and get to know what they're really, really like.
Exactly. When was the last time in an HR recommended process it had the step, sit down and have a beer with the person? Now, obviously, depending what environment you're recruiting in, it might have to be a culturally sensitive beer if you've got a Muslim candidate. But in principle, what you're talking about is, I don't just want all this rational information about what the candidate's done. And I don't want just the answers that they've kind of worked on and prepared in the interview. I want something a bit more intuitive. I want something where, my intuitions aren't always right, but I'd rather use my intuitions than not use my intuitions. I think certainly anyone in business wants to use their intuitions. They know their intuitions aren't always right, but that's why they would never dream of just handing it over to somewhere else. So that's where, and because the science base of HR want to kind of bar the door to intuitions and saying, our intuitions about people are terrible. Throw them away. Interview them in this rational, organized way. We are at risk of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. That's kind of what the book says.
So how should HR, not even HR, how do people that make decisions in an organization, because you have small organizations and you have large ones, and anything in between, what is the core process? What is the trick to the trade that enables somebody to find the perfect candidate? Or should it be something like what Google does, where they hire people, and sometimes they've been given projects, or maybe it's Apple, projects that don't actually exist in the organization, just to see how they function? That's a kind of a bit of a luxury to be able to say, hey, we're hiring you as the CFO. Here's a bunch of stuff we need you to organize, but it has actually nothing to do with the business. We just want to see how you function over the next 6 months, and then we'll really decide whether we're going to hire you.
That is quite a luxury, isn't it?
Yeah.
Not a lot
Google
of
and Apple,
organizations got that. But I mean, respect to the people who are doing that, because actually they are approaching the decision with something like both the magnitude of it and the imagination of thinking that actually success in hiring isn't just about following a rote pattern. So respect to that, I would say. Okay, I would say the key thing is, depends where you're starting from, Bob. If you're starting from a place where you haven't had any of the kind of, you're a self-made person, your decisions about people have kind of worked out for you, and you're just wondering kind of, well, how can I make them a bit better? Then I guess the message of the book would be, don't throw all that HR stuff away. Actually, you might find by reading the first few chapters of the book that you get some sobering shocks about the fact that you might be making quite a number of bad decisions along the way that haven't derailed your business so far. Okay, but then question, how would you do that better? I would say one of the key things is when you make key people decisions in that context, who do you make them with? Really don't try and make them as just one person on your own, but do try and make them with one or two others, and preferably one or two other colleagues who see things a bit different from you, and really try and have a good conversation, a good bit of a kind of pushing different views backwards and forwards about people and about what you've seen before you make your choice. And I would say that's probably what would most help such a person. If you have say you're in a large organization and you have had training up to the eyeballs. Your organization has got a competency manual and a this, that, and the other. And you are kind of feeling, so I went from bad to good, but I'm kind of feeling in the stuck place now because actually I think some of these people decisions I'm making are some of the most important decisions I will ever make that will affect my own career, never mind my customers and the people who work for me. And you've got a sense that it's time to move a bit beyond what the HR department's told you. Then hopefully my book could be helpful in suggesting some ways. It's not just a recipe of cookie cutter things saying, we'll do this and it'll all be fine. It's got some practical suggestions. But one of the things it would link up with is actually, it would hopefully free you up to try some of your own ideas, but to try them in a safe and controlled way.
I want to go back a bit. When you decided to write this book, and you were doing your doctorate, and you had this vast amount of knowledge. When you were basically pouring it onto the pages, where was the aha moment for you? Where were you saying, wow, I've known this my whole career, but now it is truly crystallized for me. I get it at a fundamental way. When did that happen, and what was it?
There were two of those, and they're really around the words kind of politics and intuition. Politics and science. Go back to why I spent 18 years as a headhunter, having started out as a financey kind of person with a math degree. I stayed a headhunter for 18 years because it was a really good way to what I call make the two halves of my brain talk to each other. What I think of as kind of like, I always get them mixed up. I don't know if you remember them right, but the left brain and the right brain, the logical brain and the emotional, intuitive brain. Headhunting was a great, great activity to force the two halves of my brain to talk to each other. Because you're a crap headhunter if you don't have any good intuitions about people, but you're also a crap headhunter if you can't critique that, provide a reasoned case, come up with evidence, and make it something more than just your gut feel. So I already knew, I didn't have an aha around intuition because I guess I pretty strongly felt, and my business life had reflected, that intuition was going to be an important part of this. It's never to be taken as always right. It's just to be taken as important to listen to. The ahas were around politics and science. And the first one that came was politics. It came in quite early on, and about 6 or 9 months into the doctorate. And they had us read a whole bunch of stuff about power and politics. And then a huge light went on. And I thought, my goodness, I'm starting to realize that actually all of life is political with a small p, to put it briefly. And why is the word so absent from management books? I mean, I thought of all the things, first of all, that I'd studied, because I had read books and articles and things about selection. Well, I defy you to point to an article on selection or a book on selection that's got anything significant on politics in it. And yet, if you're doing it at senior level, everything about how you select someone is political. And, that's a whole thing. We could go off and have another bunch of conversation. And one of the things I pursue a bit in the book and pursued in my doctorate is then even actually if you go looking for some of the books on politics, like Jeffrey Pfeffer, a well-known professor at Stanford, who's written a great book on power and politics. Even when someone's actually written, eminent professor's written a whole book specifically addressing this gap, there's still some things missing from it, I would argue. So the first aha was, my God, we are fish who swim in a sea of politics. Why does it never appear, or practically never appear, in management books, in leadership books, let alone in selection books? The other aha, which was the more difficult one, and therefore it came probably really 2 or 3 years into the doctorate, was understanding and getting a new take on the significance of science in our society and its strengths and weaknesses. Again, science is all around us. If you'd asked me about the word science 5 years ago, I'd assumed I was talking about, I don't know, pharmaceuticals and microchips and space travel and all of that. But it's much, much broader than that. It's the whole attempt in management to measure, to set targets, to look for ROI, to do all that kind of stuff. And it took a lot of reading and a lot of talking to people who knew far more than I did to start to get a glimpse and think, I'm just beginning to get an idea. Right, there's this huge thing which affects everything we do. It's so huge that it's really hard to see that it's there. And it's really good news up to a point, but it has its limitations. So those were the two ahas, one around politics and one around science. And the place I kind of end up with how it is for me now with those three ideas, I went back to the child's game of, I don't know if you play it in Canada, but stone, paper, scissors.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah?
Oh, sure.
And stone, paper, scissors, where you kind of clench your fist, and you've got those three things, and no one of them uniquely wins. Any one of them is potentially beatable. And that's how I think, actually, I've come out of the doctorate, trying to understand organizational life. Always what's going on is science, politics, and intuition. They're always there struggling away with each other. And no one of them always wins.
I wanted to talk to you about leadership or leaders.
Yeah.
With an organization, and this is something that I had an aha moment many years ago, but not that many. And it was that different organizations in different parts of the organization's life need different types of leaders. You have like a builder style leader, you have a recovery style leader, then you have a management style leader, and then you have a status quo style leader, which is like, everything's fine, we'll just trundle along. When you were in the HR industry, is that taken into consideration?
I think that in a good organization, that is often taken into consideration. I mean, for a senior role, there would be, well, first of all, there'd be some attention paid to organizational culture. And then there would be normally a clear sense from whoever's driving the appointment as to whether the culture is something that they are trying to sustain and build further, whether it's something they're trying to throw out and change completely, or whether there's something they're going to try and adjust. And those things will speak to different types of leadership action and different types of leaders. So I would say often some attempt is made to take it into account. But all too often, what then happens in practice, that thinking goes on up front, but too often we end up being dazzled by the dazzling leader instead of the piece of work that we might have done up front that pointed us to a different person. I mean, that famous business tome, good to great, and talking about level 5 leaders and so on.
Yeah.
And they can be, their achievements, if you bother to listen to them patiently, are very impressive. But they are not necessarily overwhelming and impressive individuals to meet in the flesh, just like that, in an interview. So we sometimes let ourselves down when we do a bit of smart thinking up front as to what type of leader we want, but then we sail off to an interview process and we end up seeing who dazzles us.
Yeah, well, then you get excited and, that was really entertaining. That guy would be good to have around. Instead of, what do we really need to move this whole organization forward? And is it sometimes that HR isn't properly briefed, or the people that are in the senior positions and need another senior manager or leader don't really understand where their company is in perspective? They're basically in an illusionary state as the condition of the company's in.
Sadly, there's quite often too many organizations that are in a kind of illusionary state. I think there's a bit of all of that. I think that my experience as a headhunter of dealing with the HR function, and obviously we had them as clients all the time, was that you had a small minority of truly outstanding individuals in that discipline, and they stood out a mile because they were the ones who impressed their non-HR colleagues because they had strategic grasp, they weren't just box tickers, and they got things done. That small group within HR, hopefully are being involved in some of these key decisions that we talk about. But sadly, there's a significant, I'll have to say a majority within the HR function where the impression they've given the rest of the organization is that they are concerned with what fits the HR textbook rather than solving the business problem.
Mm.
And when that happens, then both parties really have got to take responsibility for the fact that, the senior business people with the really pressing problem, they don't reach for that HR person to help them. And perhaps that HR person hasn't best equipped themselves to actually really be a real help to the business leader. Because what the book's about here is that, why the HR textbook on selection has done good, but it's not good enough when we get to senior jobs.
Mm. Well, it all, I think, harkens back to, is that you mentioned it many times, the culture of an organization. What is it as an animal? And people, when you're inside an organization, your perception of what type of business you are actually involved in is far different from how it's perceived by people outside of that organization. Like a company like Google, everybody's like, wow, it's amazing. They've heard all these stories and the process of getting into that organization. Once they get into the organization and have been involved with the organization for many years, that perception totally disappears. So is that a big hurdle for organizations?
It is. And that's why, most large quality organizations will place emphasis on succession planning. And in looking, will be looking, they'll be trying to look 3, 4, 5 years ahead to their senior leadership talent pipeline and so on. And hopefully the board will as well. And if they're seeing that it's too institutionalized, too much people, have grown up within that one way of seeing things, they will be taking action so that ahead of when the CEO job or some other big job comes vacant, they've actually brought in some outsiders, ideally, 2 or 3 years ahead of that, into some feeder roles. Because there's a lot of evidence that says that actually what you need is both. There's a fantastic book, which I'm delighted to recommend, by Joseph Gower at Harvard Business School. You might know it, called The CEO Within.
Mm-hmm.
Why Inside Outsiders Are the Key to Succession Planning.
Yep.
Very, very good practical book on that, and really bring out, how do you bring on your inside talent to think like outsiders? And if you need to bring in outsiders, and frankly, the pace at which the world is changing, most organizations should be doing something to bring in some outsiders, including into senior roles. You need to bring them into places where they've got a chance to get a handle on the organizational culture before they have to step up to really, really heavy hitting job.
Mm. Yeah, that's a very good point between hiring within and hiring without. And if there's a great book called From Buddy to Boss or something like that, and it's basically the transition period where you're working with your team and you're a team member, and then suddenly you're the boss of that team, and those guys are no longer your buddy. A lot of times that is what will make a manager fail in anything else, is they just can't psychologically step away, because being a boss and being a crew member, two totally different responsibilities, two totally different headspaces and lifestyle. Do you find that happens in high-end managerial positions where you're like a senior manager, and then you're suddenly on C-suite, and you have the same cultural shift and headspace shift that they have to go through?
Absolutely. And in my day job, I do quite a lot of coaching with individuals, often at points of career transition. And that's one of the big ones, when someone gets that sort of promotion to the C-suite level. The way I've tried to organize the book, I guess I've referenced a few business books during this chat, but one of my favorite books of ever, which isn't a business book, but I guess you might well know, is Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance.
Oh, awesome book, yep.
Isn't it? Well, sadly, my book hasn't got the talent or the richness of that, but there is one faint similarity. In Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, I just love it because it's absolutely this fantastic, demanding intellectual journey that just starts out with simple practicalities, like the motorbike and the tap washer that isn't fixed, and you start the journey with simple everyday practicalities, and then they ride up physically into the mountains, into the high peaks. and then they come down the other side. And that's kind of analog of, at the same time, it's a journey that gets into philosophy and kind of high intellectual ideas and then comes down the other side. And it's kind of the same pattern, subconsciously or not. I guess I was trying to follow with this book. I start with real hard tacks of practicalities of recruiting. And then we kind of ride up into the mountains a bit and do some philosophy, sociology, and other words that one might be allowed to say. And then it's really important to me to then bring it back to the practicalities. So there are 2 chapters in particular, and both of which are downloadable, free or nearly free. So for someone at what you were just talking about, who is approaching a major promotion point when they might get promoted, I decided to take the situation of someone who's going for their first CEO job, and thought I want to write a chapter at the end that's just all the practical advice that I've got to offer someone in that situation. I'm not talking about an entrepreneur who's going to put themselves in the CEO job. I'm talking about someone going for a CEO job where they've got to be picked by someone else. So that chapter, which is just a practical advice, is you can download that from ft.com. And the mirror image chapter, going back to the title of the book, Choosing Leaders and Choosing to Lead, they're 2 halves of the same coin to me. The other mirror image of that is someone who's in a situation for, say, a small or medium-sized organization when they have to pick a CEO. One of the most difficult, I think the most difficult selection decision there is when you have to pick a CEO for a small or medium-sized organization. Again, I wrote a chapter which is just, none of the theory, it's just whatever practical wisdom, bumps and scrapes I've learned about ways to do that. And that chapter is downloadable free from the publisher's website.
So we'll put a link. Yeah, and we'll put a link in the show notes for that. Douglas, before we go, we've talked about large organizations, we've talked about small organizations. In general, when people they own their business, they're running it themselves, and they say, geez, we've grown it to a point where we actually have to bring some people on board. And, medium-sized organizations where they already have professionals on staff and they want to grow their decision-making table, and then all the way up to the C-suite. There has to be a golden rule that covers all of those situations, or is that a fallacy?
Yeah, I think there's maybe 3 or 4 things I'd throw out that would apply in all of those. Number one is, when we make a big mistake in selecting people, it tends to happen right at the beginning. When you look back with hindsight, when I look back as a headhunter at things that went wrong, and I had my share of things that went wrong, very often the crucial mistakes, for example, a really fundamental thing about the kind of person that was needed, or the way we were going to go about the recruitment, or how we were going to pitch the compensation. Very often that mistake was made right at the beginning. So I'd say be really alert right at the beginning, as soon as you start that situation, as to what are the decisions and assumptions that you're making in those first few days that you may think are obvious, that perhaps you could actually do with testing. I'd say interviewing in pairs is absolutely great. If you are a solo entrepreneur or someone like that used to interviewing on your own, do it with somebody else. And if you're at the opposite end of the spectrum, the worst examples are academics who interview in committees of 12 or 15. That advice would be the same. Let's do it in pairs. 2 to 1 is a really great combination because it's small enough to have a real conversation, kind of like we're doing now, but actually having someone with you, it's really, really hard to listen well at the same time as you're asking the questions. Third, whatever the process is you decide to put the candidates through, however formal or informal, walk through it mentally, put yourself in the candidate's position, walk through it mentally in their shoes, and see if it feels to you like a dignified, effective, and respectful process. And remember, the clock keeps ticking. I've seen so many times that people who are hiring, be they large, medium, or small organizations, they forget that when you get a candidate interested in a senior job, they get very keyed up. They've started talking to their family about possibly relocating to, another continent or whatever it might be. When they have had a meeting with you and they don't hear anything for 2, 3, 4, 5 days. For the candidate, the clock is ticking really loudly. But so often for the hirer, they forget about that. They get caught up with their other stuff, and they just overlook how long it is since they went back and communicated to the candidate. So don't do that. And the last piece of advice is, don't negotiate with the person that you want and treat them like a second-hand refrigerator. So many times I've seen, even when people have done really great selection processes, and they found a really good person, and then they're going to come and make the offer, and some, forgive my language, dickhead will pop up from somewhere, possibly the finance department, and say, I think we could get this person cheap. This person seems really keen. Let's just lower the compensation a bit, and negotiate. It would be fine if you were hiring a second-hand fridge, because if you offer $10 for it and that gets rejected, the second-hand fridge doesn't have any feelings about that. You're dealing with a human being. You offer $10 for the human being, the human being's going to have very big feelings about it.
Yeah, and would affect them for their whole tenure in the organization. It would say, man, this is a cheap company.
They may just decide not to take the job, and they may just decide to go and badmouth your organization to a whole bunch of others.
Yep, exactly. It's called false economy, and I run into that all the time on every level of an organization where they're trying to save $1,000 or $10,000, but it's costing them hundreds of thousands of dollars in bad reputation, and it's devastating for an organization. Douglas, fantastic chatting with you. Interesting stuff. I think this book applicable to basically any size organization, and I would say an organization that wants to grow. This is a critical book that they should be looking at just to get some some idea of what they're getting involved with. Should they be hiring a freelance HR person, or should they be trying to do it on their own? Because I think that's another option. We didn't really have a chance to talk about that during the interview.
Well, thank you for the time. I really enjoyed talking about it and hope it's helpful.
All right, awesome. That was an awesome book. We have some great new books and authors for you to meet in the coming shows, and I know you will enjoy them immensely. You can contact me directly at contactbob.tel or visit our website at www.businessbooktalk.com. See you next week.